Hi, everyone. You're very welcome to this National Forum seminar. My name is Ann-Marie.Creaven. I am the host of the seminar today. And I'm delighted to say we have a number of excellent speakers on the topic of student success in undergraduate dissertation. So what I'm going to do first is explain a little bit about why we're having this particular seminar. I will show you a short video about the National Forum, and then we'll move on to our speakers. So just to give some context, I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Limerick. When I started lecturing in my post in 2013, I was really excited to be involved in undergraduate supervision. And I suppose at the end of that year, I looked at our pile of 5 undergraduate dissertations I supervised, and I thought this is excellent and it reflects my work as a supervisor and the work of 5 individual students. But as the years went on, I realized the work reflects the work of 5 individual students, but it can also involve a lot of administration in terms of research ethics applications for 5 individual projects every year. And I thought there has to be a better way of doing this. And I've noticed that informally, a lot of departments in psychology and outside of psychology use team approaches, but there's not that much documenting exactly how people do this and the benefits both for teaching and for research. So the aim of this seminar is to give some context and some practical advice and to share some experiences of using approaches to supervision that are beneficial for the learning element and for research. Now, although this is a seminar with speakers from psychology, they are from different areas of psychology, and I also think their contribution will be really beneficial outside of psychology for any type of research that involves human subjects, maybe for some types of research that involve lab data collection as well. Okay, so we're going to get started. There is a Q&A here. Please feel free to pose questions. I know among the audience we have today, we have students, we have staff, we have early career researchers. Please do post and we will get to your questions at the end of each speaker, but feel free to post as we go along. I also want to highlight one change in the lineup as well. Andrea Habenicht unfortunately cannot be with us today, but she very much wanted to have her presentation included. So we're going to hear from her third in her pre-recorded presentation before we move on to Adam's talk. And I want to highlight one final thing, and that's that this webinar is currently being recorded. So you just have a heads up on that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show a short video about the National Forum's work.
Yeah, that's better.
The mission of the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning is to establish Ireland as a global role model for higher education. The Forum mobilises sectoral energy around key enhancement themes, focusing on areas of shared interest to help stimulate innovation and excellence in teaching and learning. The Forum's first enhancement theme, Teaching for Transitions, has already helped to mobilise expertise and attention on issues of real interest and importance. The Forum's current enhancement theme, Assessment for, of and as learning, will help to stimulate innovation and excellence when it comes to developing, supporting and informing a diversity of approaches to assessing learning across all disciplines. The Forum pursues the enhancement agenda in a range of ways, including the development of a roadmap for building digital capacity, a national professional development framework for those who teach, building a strong evidence base, and linking disciplinary and pedagogical networks. The development of National Learning Impact Awards have helped to endorse and share outstanding practice in teaching and learning. By partnering with students on key projects, the Forum ensures learner participation and guidance. The National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, putting teaching and learning at the centre of sectoral enhancement and innovation.
Okay, so hopefully that gives people an overview of the work of the National Forum, and I just really want to thank them for supporting so many excellent seminars this year, including our own. So I am now going to move on to the first of our speakers, Dr. Kate Button. Introducing Kate. Dr. Kate Button is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Bath. Kate has spoken very widely on the consortium approach to supervision. And here she's going to talk a little bit about that, but also give us some context on challenges she's met along the way. And also Kate is of course open to taking questions. And if anyone has any advice they would like on implementing such a model, please do use the Q&A. So I'm going to mute myself and hand over to Kate now.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Can I just check that that's the right screen? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm delighted to be here presenting on this today. I think that the work that Anne-Marie and others are doing in Ireland has been fantastic, and then there seems to be real movement on all of these issues, which is, I think, fantastic. So my talk today is talking about our consortium approach to the empirical dissertation. So in 2016, Nature published a survey of researchers asking how many people felt there might have been a reproducibility crisis in their field. And this was sort of something I was quite embedded within at the time, in around 2013 to when I started my first lectureship in 2015. So these kind of things are really informing my thinking about research at the time, and then also moved over into my thinking about how we train the next generation of researchers in our research-led teaching to undergraduates. And some of the key things that this survey first asked researchers, do you think there is a reproducibility problem? And you can see that the vast majority of the over 1,500 responders said, yes, there definitely is. And then they asked them, what do you think are the main factors that contribute to the problems of irreproducibility in research? And you can see here that the top ones are selective reporting, so that's kind of reporting only those results that work. There's pressure to publish that I think we as academics all feel. And then we get into the kind of poor experimental design type issues of low statistical power, so routinely using studies with small sample sizes. And then we've also got poor experimental design here as well. And then the other element that people were really highlighting was that they felt as if they just weren't being sufficiently trained in rigorous research methods. Like there was a kind of this insufficient oversight or mentoring, or people feel as if they hadn't been given the tools to be able to do these things properly. So this is kind of in the wider context for the research field at the time. And so this led ourselves and others to think about, what solutions are there to some of these problems, and what things could we suggest that might overcome some of these things that are considered to be contributors to poor reproducibility. And some of the kind of main ones were things like, designing studies with large enough sample sizes for them to be able to really test what they're looking for, being able to pre-register studies and protocols and analysis plans. That gets us away from those questionable research practices, creates a nice audit trail. And one of the things we were really thinking is all of this is extra work. And one of the ways we can kind of achieve this without overburdening people is perhaps to work collaboratively, as if these things are too much to be done on one's own. And one of the key levers about bringing around some of these changes was really identified as being improved teaching and training. And this was kind of really geared towards researchers, but there's no reason that we shouldn't be starting this improved research training as early as possible. So in 2015, I sort of started my first lectureship position. This echoes much of what Anne-Marie was saying in her opening. I then started supervising lots of final year undergraduate dissertation projects, and started to think through these things, from the wider work that I've been doing on reproducibility, as almost like the problem magnified. You have lots of projects running each year. So in our department, we might have anywhere up to nearly 100 final year undergraduate psychology dissertations running in-house, but then we've also got numerous master's programs which all have to do an empirical dissertation, and we also have 100 or so placement students. So you've got hundreds of student dissertations happening in one department in any given year, and so we've got lots of projects running, but they are notoriously poorly resourced. The students only really have a matter of months to do an entire research project, right from the kind of conception up through to the dissemination of results almost. So it's not very long to be able to deliver a really high quality project at each, if we think about each of the stages in a high quality research project. They often don't come with very much resource, so you might not have any money associated with the students. If you live somewhere like Claverton down in Bath, we're right at the top of a hill. I don't know if anyone's ever been to the University of Bath, but trying to get participants to come up from the city itself, you can't really do that without paying for transport or other things. So sometimes access to participants can be challenging. We also very much had and we still do have a culture of assessment where the focus is really often on individual contributions and creativity and novelty. So this idea that the student's able to come up with a really novel creative idea where they're filling a gap that's never been done before, and it's all their own work and they can show it's their individual contributions. And all of this, I think, leads to it echoes what was going on in the wider research community, but it also leads to the potential for multiple studies, which are potentially small, underpowered, poorly designed. This focus on testing novel hypotheses rather than replication, and the potential to be analysed with undisclosed flexibility. So this kind of led me to really reflect, how can we square the circle for research-led teaching? We know that there are some really good practices that are coming from the research world now, the kind of larger sample sizes, pre-registration, there's the whole open research movement, which is very exciting, and really increasing transparency in the research that we do. But all of these things take extra time and resources. And I've already just explained that student projects are really time limited, poorly resourced. There's this focus on assessment criteria for novelty and individual contributions. So how do we somehow square this circle to bring best teaching practice, best research practices into our research-led teaching? And I also, when I've been reflecting on this, kind of think there is some reflection to be done about where we sit with this pedagogy versus research sort of tension. I've been reflecting on this a lot myself, because I very much came from a kind of strong research background, and so I suppose my focus is always lent towards, if I was very reflecting on my own values, has lent towards doing that. We learn the best when we're learning best practices in high quality research projects, and we get to see how best practice looks like. But obviously that requires a very scaffolded environment to create that structure where people are able to learn from best practice. But then we also have another approach, which I think is equally valid, but has different implications for this research pedagogy tension, of where we might start off thinking, well, actually the student may learn best from actually just doing everything themselves from scratch, coming up with their own research idea and working their way through it. And then it's going to be very variable whether or not the quality is there, whether they have the time to kind of learn from all of those mistakes and various things. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I just think it's an interesting personal reflection to kind of think, before we even embark on the research, where do we sit along this kind of research-led continuum? And I think positioning ourselves within it helps us then think about what we need to do going forward when we're thinking about the use of our research at the end, I suppose, is what I'm suggesting. Okay, so the solution that we came up with, and I do very much sit to the kind of the research side of that continuum, as it were, was a solution for a multi-centre methodology for undergraduate projects. So we would get the students to work collaboratively with supervisors across different institutions to improve the quality of research training in open research, but also to really improve the quality of the research outputs. So we really want to have our cake and eat it. We want to be training the students in the best open research methods, but we also want to make sure that they're having an opportunity to contribute to the highest quality research that meets all the current kind of best practices. And so the idea is, by working collaboratively, students can pool all of their data collection and generate much larger sample sizes that they all benefit from. So pool their efforts to collect one large sample that they can all use. This has the potential to increase the generalizability of their findings, because you're recruiting from multiple different centres across the UK. And also has potential to increase transparency, because when you're working in large teams, you need to have very transparent research practices, so everybody is following the same research procedure. We also adopted all of the open research practices, so we pre-register everything on the Open Science Framework, open data, open resources where possible, and all of this was designed in a way that would still allow the individual student assessment. And so I presented this idea to the British Psychological Society Undergraduate Education Committee in 2016, and they really liked it, and they actually now explicitly endorse group-based projects in their accreditation guidance to universities. So I think this is a really positive step forward, and I think this is, you know, if you can point to the BPS accreditation guidelines in the UK, then you can say, well, you know, why aren't we all doing this? So it's a real good thing that you can kind of go back to your departments with and say, you know, these things are being endorsed, so we can definitely, you know, there's no barriers to taking this approach. However, you will notice that they still suggest that provided there are still provided the students are still required to demonstrate the above skills individually. And so that's really where our approach is kind of thought quite carefully about how can we ensure that each student has their own individual, or is able to showcase their skills individually, but whilst also kind of having the opportunity to demonstrate their wonderful team skills as part of this big team project. And so this is the kind of structure that we developed. So we have this overarching primary aim of the study. So the study overall has one primary aim, or a couple of primary aims, and those are pre-registered, and that's the high quality research idea that gets out there and is pre-registered. And if we ever, you know, when we publish our publications from this, that will be what the publications are primarily looking at. So there's this one overarching primary aim, which is pre-registered on behalf of the whole consortium. But then we build in this kind of individuality for the students by allowing them to, or encouraging them to kind of add something to the research design by developing their own secondary hypotheses and adding their own methods and measures into the study, so that they've had their own part of the project that is kind of all their own. And so this means that you have multiple student-led secondary hypotheses. And so each of those can then become the basis of their dissertation. So you have slightly different dissertations for each of the students, but all in all, they're all contributing to this overarching primary pre-registered hypothesis. And so we've had lots of different structures. This is just a kind of example one. We've had anywhere between 3 and 5 participating universities, or supervisors from up to 5 different universities. We usually have around 4. So we have one supervisor in each of the psychology departments in each of, say, 4 different universities, and they will each have a given number of undergraduate students who are working with them. I've got 3 on the slide here, but it's been anywhere between 2 to 6 or 7 or something. You know, it really depends on the supervisors' kind of workload and their team at the time. And one of the things that happened in the first year was that, you know, it's very new and naive, I suppose, but it was quite a lot to manage a project of this size with multiple sites. And so it very quickly became apparent that a postdoc called a postdoc from Cardiff was actually called Rachel, was actually ending up taking over the role of being almost the principal investigator and the trial coordinator of all of this, because you do need somebody in that role to kind of manage the greater complexity. And so from the first year onwards, we then built into it that actually the project has a project lead who's usually a PhD student. And so that student then gains experience of being a trial coordinator stroke principal investigator of a multi-center trial. They then get to gain experience of leading that research, taking a lead on developing the research proposal and the protocol, taking a lead on kind of managing the open science framework and sort of driving all the research ideas. And so they're getting wonderful CV experience in that very scaffolded opportunity to kind of lead a multi-center study, whilst also having ownership and first authorship on any papers and so on. So there's real kind of rewards for the PhD student who takes a role, but it also means that you have a dedicated person who is making sure that the study is running really coherently. So that would be my first piece of advice if you're going to take this approach, is try and think about a kind of somebody who might have the time and energy to really kind of manage this as a kind of almost like a principal investigator. And all of that's within the security of having the supervisors kind of overseeing the supervision of the undergraduate students from their academic perspective. And so the way we work it is that a university, you know, there's one PhD student from a given university who leads the project that year, and all the other university are kind of really good collaborators and take part. And then we rotate who takes the lead on each year, because obviously it's a real opportunity to have some really, you know, to have a lead on your own research getting done, but it also comes with a lot of responsibility in terms of workload, and it is a big job. So we manage that by rotating who it takes a lead on, at which university takes a lead on the project each year. Okay, so I think that would be my first key piece of advice. It really helps to identify a kind of a research principal investigator to kind of keep oversight of the project. And so this is how we focused on squaring the circle kind of to align education needs with rigorous science. This is the kind of timetable that we came up with. So in the preceding year, the supervisors and the kind of PhD student and postdocs come up with a bare bones protocol. So we come up with an overarching research question and a pre-registered, like the kind of main aim and hypothesis that will be pre-registered, and a kind of general structure of how we think the research design will look. We then give the bare bones protocol to the students over the summer, and they're encouraged to go and think about what additional questions, what research questions they might like to add into that bare bones protocol. And they come up with a little mini analysis plan, so they have to develop their own research question. They then propose a hypothesis. They then propose the measures or the methods that they would need to use within the kind of the framework we've already provided of how they would go about testing that hypothesis, and they develop a mini analysis plan. So they're doing all the main elements of a kind of pre-registration, but in a really condensed mini version over the summer. And then in October, we used to have the first big consortium meeting where each student would then be given an opportunity to present their idea for their secondary analysis, secondary research question to the whole team. And we'd go around the whole group and then discuss the merits of each, and then many people might have done similarly overlapping things. So we then might discuss, somebody's got this measure that's similar, someone's got that measure that's similar, like what's the pros and cons of using these different measures. And we would then have a big roundtable discussion and really thrash out the final shape of the research proposal. And that would then get pre-registered on the Open Science Framework. Data collection would then start, ethics applications would go in, data collection would then start. And then we would finish in around sort of March time, and the students would then be given the data set and write up their different hypotheses. We would then have a second meeting in March or April where all the students would come together and they do like a mini results conference where they would then present the results from their individual dissertation, and we would then also look at the main study findings and collaboratively determine any conclusions that we think for any paper that would come out of that. And then the students obviously submit their dissertations, and it would be the lead PhD student or postdoc who then carries on the work to draft any manuscripts and prepare the data for open science and any materials for publication and so on. So that's again why it's quite important, I think, to have that early career researcher in as the kind of principal investigator in some way, because the students will eventually, their time will be up and they will leave, and it's good to have somebody who can carry on taking this forward. So this is what we used to do, but then COVID happened this year. So now everything's virtual. We've just started having weekly full consortium meetings via Zoom. So rather than having two big meetings where we'd all meet and then individual supervisions within the host institutions sort of through the rest of the time, now, this year, everything's been done on Teams. So we've been meeting as a whole consortium, all 21 of us, every Wednesday for the whole time. And actually, it's worked really well. So I think that might be one of the, one good thing that came out of COVID is that might become the dominant model. Okay, so I'm probably aware of time. Let me just have a quick look. So when we're thinking about how do we have this overarching research question and then build in these secondary analyses for the students, one model we found works really well is this replication and extension model. So this is an example from the first consortium we ever did. We took a paper that some of the collaborators had published, which was looking at training response inhibition to food and its associated with weight loss and reduced energy intake. So it's an intervention study. And that had been a randomized control trial which had found that this inhibition training had actually really worked to kind of reduce wanting and unliking of unhealthy foods. So the primary research question for our first consortium was a replication of this training effect. And the question was, does inhibitory control training relative to control reduce wanting and liking of unhealthy foods? And then the students were encouraged to go away and think about what additional questions might be really interesting. So many of them came up with kind of moderator questions. So for example, one student might have thought, okay, I'd be really interested to know whether the treatment effect is moderated by trait impulsivity. And then they would give a directional hypothesis, such that the more impulsive a person is, the more effective the training will be. So in their dissertation, they would write up the main training effect, and then they would also focus very much on the role of trait impulsivity in moderating the training effect, but also the kind of the role of trait impulsivity generally in eating. So that's how they would have their individual contribution. And so we adhere to all of the things that I suggested at the beginning. The first consortium we ever did, we did a sample size calculation based on the treatment effect in that Lawrence et al. 2015 paper. And we estimated that with 80% power and 5% alpha, we would need 106 people across the two arms to be able to replicate that effect. But because each student was then adding their own moderator hypotheses, and they're notoriously underpowered, we quadrupled the sample size to hopefully give the students enough power to look at their moderator hypotheses. And now some of you who have been teaching longer than I had at the time might look at that and say, that seems quite ambitious, and you'd be right. So I think that, again, it was my kind of, slight naivety in my first lectureship post. And we actually got a very good sample size of 238, which is really pretty good for a group of undergraduate projects, but it's not near our very ambitious 412 was probably a bit over ambitious. So I've learned a lot from that. We have to be quite a bit more modest. You do get big sample sizes, but there are limits. But the key thing is the way that we designed the study is that it's all about that primary replication hypothesis for the publication. So we're adequately powered for our primary aim, which means that the main research idea is integrity is kept. But obviously the students were slightly underpowered for their dissertations, but still pretty damn good sample size for most of, for an undergraduate dissertation. And the paper for this is now under review. So then we learned from our mistakes in the second year, and we designed a more simple, so that first one was actually also a training intervention. So they came into the lab, they had their baseline measures, they then had to go away and train either on the active or the control intervention for a week, and then we come back and measured their kind of liking and wanting of food. So again, those of you that are more experienced in undergraduate supervision than I was at the time would also know that a kind of multiple session is always going to be another kind of difficulty because of attrition and so on. So it was a very ambitious first project. So the second year we ran it, we simplified things right down. We had a kind of single session experimental design. We did our sample size calculation based on a published effect. And we would have 90%, really quite high alpha, stringent alpha and very high power with only 149 participants. Each student did the same thing, contributed their own moderator hypotheses, and we finished that recruitment very easily, in fact early, and the paper was submitted quite quickly. So the other thing that we do in this is we collectively write protocols and a priori statistical analysis plans, which we publish on the Open Science Framework. And so if you want to go and have a look, these four, there are 5 up at the moment, but these 4 are the ones that I think are out of embargo now. So you can go and have a look at some of the examples we've done there. And again, each student contributes their own moderator hypothesis and analysis plan. So they qualify for authorship. And because these things are in the public domain, they actually get a DOI or a citation that the students can add to their CVs. We also work quite hard to try and make the final data sets and materials available on the Open Science Framework. And where possible, if tasks can be programmed in open source software such as Python, then we do that. But we only go as far as, we do as much as we can, but we have to be mindful of the time limits that we have as well. Okay, so what do the students think? I probably have to finish now. Do let me know if you want me to finish, Ann-Marie, because I've got a few minutes left, or I've only got a few slides left. So, so support from peers was one of the things they really enjoyed, they thought was a major advantage. They really liked working with other people. The students loved the bigger data sets and sharing ideas. They liked the pre-registration transparency. They really enjoyed that they felt they could recruit a really large amount of people. They learned lots from their peers. It's a really good example of peer-to-peer learning. And they also get supervised by, 4 different academic supervisors across 4 different institutions. So they actually get quite a lot of insight into how much supervisor opinions might differ as well. So it's actually, I think they do get a really rich experience of learning from both supervisors, but also other students. But there are some disadvantages. And they do find the differences in deadlines a bit tricky because each institution might have different deadlines. They did note that they had slightly less say in the design, so they might really want to do something that just meant that they couldn't do because it was too much of a change away from the original thing, or it would impact on other people's things too much. So it did constrict what they could do a little bit. People relied on me, a bit of pressure, is that a disadvantage or is that a wonderful kind of key skill that all employees are looking for. Communication between universities, confusing when researchers have different ideas. It's difficult to cover all parts of the consortium project due to limited word count, so sometimes they found the write-up a bit more tricky. But I think many of those disadvantages, actually, when we're thinking about what employers want, you know, those team skills and so on, those are all actually really good skills that these students are developing, transferable skills that go beyond go beyond purely research, but could be very useful in the workplace. So I'm going to conclude now. I'm sorry if I've run over slightly. There are solutions to the problem of irreproducibility, but rigorous research takes more time and resources. We know systemic change is happening. Funders, publishers, researchers, universities are all moving on this in the wider research world. So really, if we're going to be training our students as the next generation of researchers, we need to be preparing them for open research. I think consortium studies offer a really good way to tackle some of these issues. Students participate in training rigorous methods from the start, and the aim is that we're instilling best practice in the grassroots, and hopefully we can start to change scientific culture from the ground up. So I'd just like to acknowledge all my wonderful collaborators, and there are lots of them, and I'm happy to take any questions or wait to the end after everyone else has spoken.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's always so interesting to hear about the consortium approach, and especially in light of COVID, to see what's changed. There are a few questions, but if it's all right with everybody, I might leave them to the end. I will note that we will talk a bit about qualitative, and I'm really interested to hear other thoughts on that as well. So just to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Emily Nordman is a lecturer in the University of Glasgow Department of Psychology. Emily is going to discuss some ideas that myself, Emily, Kate, and also Heather, who isn't here today from the University of Glasgow, have been talking about in relation to building on this consortium idea. So as Kate noted in her talk, it's a significant undertaking. You have to plan a year ahead. If you are a new supervisor, you're not going to have those resources if you don't have a postdoc or a senior PhD student in place to operate that PI role. You might also be unable to manage that. So I'm going to hand over to Emily now to talk about some other models of supervision that might also build on these team approaches.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Okie dokie. So I cannot see the chat. So if there's any questions or comments or anything, I will just deal with them at the end, if that's okay. So yes, thank you very much. As Ann-Marie has said, I'm from the School of Psychology at the University of Glasgow, and I am a lecturer there, but in particular, I am a teaching focused lecturer on the scholarship track, which is potentially useful context in terms of thinking about what Kate said about how she's coming at it very much from a research point of view. I kind of come at this very much from I think the other end of the spectrum, which hopefully is why what we've proposed in this paper represents a diversity of thought and a diversity of perspectives. So Kate's just presented the consortium model, which has obviously many, many benefits, but as both Kate and Ann-Marie have noted, this isn't a model that's open to everyone. The project management side of things really does require a postdoc, which of course not everyone always has, but particularly if you're teaching track like me, you're never going to have that. But there are also smaller scale practical issues. Someone's already noted in the chat, what happens if your departmental dissertation timelines are just completely different, or if you don't know how many dissertation students you're going to have until like the week before the process kicks off, or as someone's noted in the chat, what happens if you want to do mixed methods or qualitative designs. So what we have done is to write a new paper that provides a greater range of both individual and group dissertation models that have kind of the same underlying ethos as the consortium model, but provide solutions for when you perhaps don't have the time or the resources to commit to this full consortium model. So yes, the paper's been written with Ann-Marie as the lead, and then myself and Kate, and also my colleague Heather Woods from the University of Glasgow. And we really, really would like as much feedback as possible on the different models that we're going to suggest today. So the models that we suggest can be broadly split into two strategies, and it's really worth saying at this point that we do not think that we are presenting anything completely novel here. I imagine that many of you will have done at least one of these models before. what we were trying to do was to try and bring these models together to highlight that these should increasingly be our standard approach to the dissertation process rather than the exception to the rule. And COVID, I think, has really highlighted why these kind of approaches are important. So we have 3 models that are all based around the use of secondary data, and principally not generating any new primary data. And then 3 models that also take a team science approach, which is very similar to the Consortium Model, but these kind of team approaches that can be implemented at a smaller scale. And all of these adhere to the BPS and the PSI standards for accreditation. So the first model is using secondary data for analysis in the dissertation. And this could be research data that is publicly available, for example, on the OSF, or it could be data that has been previously collected by the supervisor and has been sitting in a file drawer. And I suspect with the COVID restrictions, we've already seen an uptick in the number of secondary data dissertations this year. The reasons for this approach are, I assume quite obvious. Secondary data reduces research waste by avoiding the further collection of, potentially this small scale primary data. But there are also, these really large representative data sets available. So by using these, you can increase statistical power. A really nice feature of using secondary data is that in terms of formative milestones, students can also, replicate known effects in the data before moving on to their specific new research question. Or indeed, they could try and reproduce the analyses of published papers. And that can teach students a huge amount about reproducibility, about transparent reporting, and about the importance of clear documentation. And it can act just as that, like little milestone at the beginning of the project to get them going. In terms of considerations for implementation, depending upon the format that the data comes in, students might not have the necessary data wrangling skills to deal with it. At the moment, a lot of psychology programs still tend to focus on the end point of statistics. We tell them how to conduct and interpret tests, but we have typically handed them clean data to work with. And of course, part of the nature of secondary data analysis is that you have to work with potentially messy data. You have to work with other people's data, other people's coding schemes, and so on. Now, this isn't a reason not to do it. And in fact, this might actually be an excellent reason to do it because of the skills that students will develop. But it is really worth being mindful of what skills your students are bringing to the dissertation process and how much support you might need to give them. Finally, secondary data, of course, means that they won't get any experience of primary data collection. And depending upon your departmental guidelines, they might also not have to write an ethics application. So it's worth considering, what experience they will have had up until that point and whether or not you might want to build in some kind of mock formative exercises to help them get this experience, even if it's not necessary for the project. The second secondary data approach is very similar to the first one, but rather than using secondary research data, you can use public data that was not originally intended for research purposes. So by this, we mean things like scraping data from Twitter or online forum discussions. And the reasons for this are very largely similar to the secondary data research in that it reduces the generation of primary data and it can increase statistical power. An additional benefit that comes from using things like Twitter is that because there's just such a huge amount of data available and it just, it's increasing by the day, you can build in replication and pre-registration. So for example, I had a dissertation student last year who was looking at the expression of anger on Twitter, and it was a completely exploratory project. But what we were able to do was download a huge amount of data, and we then just went on a fishing trip. We ran a bunch of exploratory analyses. And then based on the results of that, we then pre-registered our confirmatory hypotheses, scraped all the data again, and then we replicated the analyses to test our confirmatory approach. This approach is not new. I have just described a pilot study. The reason it's noteworthy is because this kind of pilot testing isn't really feasible within the timeline of the dissertation process if you're collecting primary data. It's the specific use of secondary data that actually allowed us to do this. The considerations for implementation are, again, very similar to secondary data. The big thing is probably ethics, in that you will absolutely need to get ethical approval to use this kind of data. And that approval is very likely to involve a much more stringent data management plan and thinking about anonymity. And it's really important as a supervisor that you recognize the student's probably going to need additional support with that, because these are the kind of issues, GDPR, all that stuff, that they may not have had to deal with. And the ethics about using public data are still up for debate, particularly when it comes to things like Twitter. The final secondary data model is to conduct an evidence synthesis, and specifically a systematic review with meta-analysis. And this could be either quantitative or qualitative. In terms of a rationale, well, not only does an evidence synthesis reduce the generation of primary data, but it means that the student will engage very deeply with the research in their content area. And if it's done well, you really can look to make a valuable contribution to the literature. It's also worth maybe highlighting that actually this kind of review process gives them such clear transferable skills and experience. There are many, many non-research jobs that require people to review a body of evidence. If you think about the third sector and policymakers and so on, this is something that students can really highlight as a skill. In terms of consideration and implementation, the big one is that in order to meet BPS standards for accreditation, there must be a meta-analysis. So I'm not quite sure what the PSI standards say, but for the BPS, there must be a meta-analysis. The systematic review on its own isn't enough. It's also quite likely that their research methods training won't have covered systematic reviews. So either the supervisor needs to factor that training in, or you might need to get external training or so on. And finally, because students are required to do both the review and the meta-analysis for accreditation, depending upon the size of the literature, this could potentially result in a huge workload. And so this actually might be better suited to a group project, which then has some of the collaborative considerations that we're about to cover. So the next three models are all about team science. And the first one really is the Consortium Model, but on a smaller scale. So rather than teaming up across different institutions, this could be where a single supervisor with multiple students combine studies, or it could be multiple supervisors within the same department also have similar research interests. So for example, at Glasgow, we have, I think, 3 sleep researchers. And typically when these researchers design survey studies, they all have the same core questionnaires about sleep. And then of course, there's the extra measures that are tapping their specific research question. So rather than these 3 researchers, each with 6 students running multiple studies, the idea is that a single survey can be produced that has the core measures and then additional measures as necessary for the specific project. But this could also be lab-based studies. So for example, if you have a number of students who are all interested in, let's say, executive function, but some of them are looking at the relationship with another cognitive measure, maybe some of them are interested in demographic differences like bilingualism, these projects could be combined. The benefits of this approach are very obvious and very similar to the consortium model. So instead of 3 smaller studies, each recruiting 50 participants on an overlapping set of measures, you have one study that recruits 150 participants for all measures at once, so you can increase statistical power. The considerations for implementation are also very similar to the consortium model. You might not be working across institutions, but collaboration from the beginning is still crucial. And that's whether that's between, just your own pool of students, or if there's additional members of staff, that collaboration will need to be managed. And the students need to be aware of what they're signing up for at the start of the process. There's also things like you need to ensure that there's no diffusion of responsibility, so it's not the case that one student ends up doing all of the work. And similar to the consortium model, you do need to build in pre-registration for the individual research questions and hypotheses. And finally, there's also an issue of whether or not you want to supervise these students as a group, so like kind of in the same thing that Kate was talking about, or if you want to still supervise them one-on-one. And there's lots of considerations to take into account there about the individual students' needs. The second team model is specifically focused on qualitative research. So this is where a pair of students who have distinct but related research questions work together on interviews. So this is a model that Ann-Marie has used, and I believe Andrea's presentation is going to be about this model. So the idea is that the students come up with a common interview schedule. They divide the workload of the interviews, and then they transcribe the interviews that they did not conduct themselves. So the rationale for this model is that it really encourages peer support between the student pair. So, the development of the questions, participant recruitment and transcription, all of these can involve a heavy workload, and all of these also hugely benefit from a second pair of eyes and discussion. And whilst qualitative research obviously doesn't have the same concerns about statistical power, this model also recognises that when it comes to dissertations, because of the drive to give each student an individual project, we might sometimes carve them up into smaller bits than we necessarily would if this was kind of one of our just regular research projects. So by kind of combining them, you recognize that these aren't, individual little niche questions. You can actually look at a broader picture. In terms of implementation, so I'm sure Andrea is going to speak about this as well, but it really is about ensuring that the two research questions are very well specified before the interviews begins. So that the interview questions do actually tap both sides. So you don't just end up with some kind of vague coverage of both in a very general way, that both research questions are actually being tapped there. And that means that each student needs to be very clear on the purpose of their part. But also, in order to conduct the interviews effectively, they need to be confident about the other research question as well, because they're sharing the interviews. And this issue of variability kind of also comes in terms of interview skill and work ethic, and it's something you need to consider as a supervisor and manage that from the start. So, again, that one student doesn't take on all the work, or indeed, one student doesn't feel that their project was compromised because the other student didn't conduct the interviews properly, or so on. The final team science model is that of a paired mixed method design. So 2 students, 1 broad research question, 1 qual, 1 quant. And this can be either a convergent design where they run simultaneously, or an exploratory or explanatory design where one builds on the other. The rationale for the mixed method approach isn't so much about reducing research waste, in that both studies still potentially suffer from the same criticisms of an individual dissertation project, but it does allow for a more robust exploration of the research question. Through triangulation, you get both depth and breadth to your conclusions. From the student perspective, it also makes peer support very easy, because they are essentially separate projects. They have different methodologies, hypotheses, epistemological approaches, but because they both become experts in the same theoretical field, it becomes much easier for them to support each other without worrying about their individuality. Mixed method designs, of course, require either mixed method expertise from the supervisor or a co-supervisor or collaborator. Probably the main practical issue to consider is that as a supervisor is the timeline. So if you're doing exploratory or explanatory designs, one student has to go first. And there needs to be a backup plan for what happens if that first student doesn't or can't meet the deadlines to allow the second student to start. And that did actually happen to me this year. I had to flip things about kind of at the start of term because it became clear that the original plan wasn't going to work. So those are the 6 models. But we do have a 7th section to the paper, which isn't really a model, but it's more an underlying ethos, which is that we think that it's really important that regardless of what dissertation model you adopt or what methodological or epistemological stance you take, that we need to include more transparency in the dissertation process as standard. I think perhaps increasingly, academics are using the work conducted as part of dissertations to publish. And I would argue that this actually increases the risk of publication bias even more than normal, particularly in the case of student-led research projects. So what I mean by this is the projects where the student comes to you with their own idea. And it's maybe not your exact area of expertise, but they're really passionate about it. So you let them do it. Because above all else, the dissertation is a learning process. It's their education. And I imagine the very large majority of academics have supervised projects like this before. Some do it just as that's, all of them are student-led. If we think about the usual research cycle for a researcher-led project, there's now this quite famous figure by Chris Chambers about where the various sources of bias and questionable research practices come in. So we're supposed to generate hypotheses before we look at our data. We're not supposed to stop data collection when we get a significant result and so on. The issue is that this is what happens when you have a researcher-led project, when the person designing the study is an expert. Now, I'm absolutely not arguing that experts are infallible, replication crisis, hello. This is simply to say that all of this stuff happens when you've got oversight at each stage by people who have, at least postgraduate level training in their field. The other thing about this cycle is that the intention to submit is pretty much assumed from the start. With a researcher-led project, you assume that it's being designed with the intention of contributing to the literature, and you assume that there's going to be a certain quality control because of that. Obviously, it doesn't always happen, but that assumption is there. When it comes to publishing student-led research projects, this is what should happen. So the student should generate their hypothesis and design the study. And then at that stage, the supervisor should review the study and assess whether or not it's suitable for publication. You can maybe think of this as like the stage 1 registered report review. You might decide that it's methodologically rigorous and it has potential. You might go and ask them to change something, or you might go, do you know what? This isn't a bit perfect. I'm not going to publish this, but it's the students' own work. They're learning a lot from the process. So what the hell? And you just let them go on. What should happen is that the ones you said what the hell to, they should remain as a dissertation. And it's only the ones that you judge at this early design stage should go on to be considered for publication. And, they're still susceptible to all the issues that we normally see, but there is that decision's being made at the design stage. The problem is that what can or does happen is that, the student goes on their merry way, they design the study and collect the data, analyze it, write it up. And the supervisor's never really given a lot of critical thought to whether there's going to be publication. The intention was probably that this was just a dissertation. But then it turns out that, it's a diamond in the rough. The results are compelling. The student has done a great job of the write-up. And suddenly you start thinking, actually, maybe we could get something out of this. Maybe we could submit this. The issue is that not only is this the file draw effect in action, in that, null results, you're not going to think that. But then there's this extra influence of the quality of the student write-up, compounded by the fact that you might not have been as critical as you should be about the design. Because you were like, it's a learning experience, it's fine. But once you've seen the results and the write-up, you're then in that dangerous territory where it becomes incredibly easy to justify to yourself that actually, this was always a good project because you can suddenly see a publication. What we need to introduce as a standard part of the dissertation project, particularly for those of us who are going to use dissertation projects for publication, is just a greater level of transparency. Now, this could be as simple as pre-registering the hypotheses. It could be a study protocol, but just something at this stage that says, yes, this is a dissertation project, but the same care and attention has been paid as if it was, kind of a regular research project. I do intend to, submit this for publication. By no means is full analytic pre-registration suitable for all designs or all students. But we now have the tools at our disposal. So for example, using the OSF or GitHub to build in these kind of checks and balances. And actually from a pedagogical perspective, I found that getting students to work through a full pre-registration is so incredibly useful for their understanding. And also as a milestone, the dissertation process it's the largest project they've ever done. And they do struggle with just having that single deadline. Pre-registration can actually really help them to focus their ideas, and it makes the analysis part so much easier because they're actually breaking up the workload. They're doing the thinking in advance. So that's the short version of our paper. I will put the link in the chat in a second. In summary, the dissertation is a learning process, and we absolutely, no one is advocating that we should be prioritizing publications over pedagogy. However, the way that research is being conducted is moving forward. The days of the lone psychology researcher are kind of over. And our dissertation model should reflect that if we want that learning experience to be useful. The BPS standards, as Kate have said, already do, but we need it to be kind of the standard rather than just something people might do. We also need to recognise that the dissertation process has contributed to the problems we've seen in the wider field by producing huge amounts of unnecessary low quality or underpowered primary data, and that publishing student-led projects in some ways does carry additional risks, but we can mitigate these issues with increased transparency and by adopting alternative models that maximise both the educational and research value of the dissertation. So thank you very much particularly to Anne-Marie for bringing us all together, and thank you to my co-author as well. And I will put that link in the chat now.
Thanks so much, Emily. I think it's great to have somebody coming from a more teaching focused background to contribute. And certainly a lot of the ideas we discussed, I hope, are useful to people who are interested in a consortium model, but aren't sure about how to get started. I just want to note, I had written some of the section on evidence synthesis. And the BPS and PSI guidelines, they don't specifically make a comment about evidence synthesis, but my interpretation of them for everyone listening is that they require some sort of data analysis or computation. So although they haven't said you can't do a systematic review without the meta-analysis, I would be hesitant to let a student do that in light of the guidelines. So I think that could be something that could be clarified.
I think we checked with them this year because of we were told that it was that there needed to be that meta-analysis.
Yeah, that was my interpretation, but I don't think they had written it explicitly in relation. Yeah, so I just wanted to be sure everyone's on the same page for that. Okay, so we're a bit over time, but I left quite a considerable time at the end in case this happened. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to take some questions at the end of everything. I'm going to deal with technology, grapple with it further, and upload Andrea's presentation. And then we'll conclude with Adam's, where they'll give a relatively recent student perspective on working as a team. So I'll just mute myself for a sec and I will upload Andrea's presentation. Okay, so if someone wouldn't mind, Emily, Kate, or Adam, let me know if you can't hear this in a minute or two.
Will do.
Hi there, my name is Andrea Habenicht. I'm a first year Doctorate of Clinical Psychology student in the University of Limerick. Sorry I can't be there today for the Teaming Up for Student Success in the Undergraduate Dissertation live webinar. A prior commitment came up, but I still wanted to contribute my personal experience, so hence this.
Okay, so that was working perfectly till I just check the chat. So what I'll do is I won't check the chat until we're finished, and I'll mute and I'll start again. Thanks so much.
PowerPoint has been created. For a bit of context about me, as I said, I'm a first year DClin student, but I actually did both my undergraduate and my master's degrees here in UL as well. So from my undergraduate degree, I did joint data collection. Essentially, myself and a peer pooled our resources and we completed one ethics forum and one set of interviews with 2 separate research questions. For my master's then, I worked individually, had my own research question, my own data collection, etc. In terms of how I experienced or how I found both experiences of working individually and part of a team when completing a dissertation, there was benefits and disadvantages to both, but overall I can say that I definitely preferred working as part of a team. For my master's dissertation, it felt like a much bigger undertaking completing it alone. Now, there is a caveat in that I was doing statistical analysis from my master's, which wouldn't be my preference of methodology. So there was potentially more pressure on myself, and that's why it felt, I suppose, slightly more stressful. However, for my undergraduate degree, I had the added benefit of constant support. Even though we were looking to completely different research questions, there was someone that I could ask questions to, even if they felt slightly silly and I maybe wouldn't feel the need to bring them to my supervisor. And there was someone there who I could just bounce ideas off of the whole time. If I break this down further and look at the advantages and disadvantages of joint data collection, the advantages included having an extra set of eyes to proofread. What I mean by that is that someone other than my supervisor vaguely understood my topic and could comment on whether I was being concise enough. They understood the scope and the aims of what I was trying to do with my research. Additionally, the 2 next points kind of go hand in hand in that we only had to complete one ethics form. Additionally, that meant that we had half the time each of us respectively put into the ethics forum and half the time that we put into both doing the interviews and the transcription. And for anyone who has thought about doing qualitative research, the transcription side can be a large demand on your time. Of course, coding had to be done individually, as we were looking at data with separate lenses, but still there was a huge contribution in the fact we were working together and we were both saving ourselves time. The next point as an advantage then is that we were able to do mock interviews with each other as well. As there were 2 researchers, myself and my peer, collecting the data, so doing the interviews with our participants, we had to make sure we were rigorous in that we were asking the same questions. Because of this, we were able to do mock interviews with each other, and this gave us the added benefit of being able to really solidify our approach, to create rapport with the participants while not asking any leading questions. Finally, I think I had the added benefit of having 2 supervisors. By this I mean that my peer's supervisor was also linking in terms of how my research was going, and my supervisor, who was Ann-Marie.Creaven in this case, was able to link in with my peers as well. Having these 2 really experienced mentors to run things by was really helpful, as you always felt that you were being well, I suppose, well looked after, and you had really good research kind of foundations to model yourself on as well. In terms of disadvantages then to the joint data collection, I had to be conscious of not taking my peers' references. That's why I put extra set of eyes to proofread as also a disadvantage. When reading my peers' different drafts and say parts of the ethics, certain things would pop up that I'd go, oh, that would make great sense for my own research. Obviously, this can't happen, and you can't be plagiarizing each other's work. So it was definitely an extra layer of consciousness when trying to see how to help them, but also not to subconsciously take their work. The other disadvantage I found to the joint data collection, was that I'm not exactly sure how I would have fared if I had to do this project alone in terms of time management. This meant that I came out with a slight sense of imposter syndrome. And by that, I mean that I felt potentially that I wouldn't have done as good a piece of research had it not been for the peer I was working alongside. Now, thankfully, during my master's, my supervisor was able to support me to see I was capable of doing a piece of research without someone working alongside me. But during the master's, during the undergrad, I did feel that I nearly needed to have someone double check things for me. In terms then of the advantages and disadvantages of working singly for my master's, for the advantages, one huge advantage for me was working to my own timeline. I wasn't waiting on someone else to complete a piece of work so that I could continue. Now, this wasn't a huge issue for me in the joint data collection. We were both of a similar mindset to get it done and get it done on kind of an efficient timeline. So we had time for analysis and write-up, which was greatly needed for qualitative methods. But there was a few minor situations during the undergrad where I was conscious of going, oh, she's still working, therefore I should be working. Or she has 4 transcriptions complete, I only have 2. Being able to set my own timeline then and work at my own pace really, I think, eased the stress on me. Additionally, I was able to easier boundary myself. And by that, I mean I'm quite a perfectionist. So again, kind of similar to the last point, if I heard my peer researcher was working, I felt the need to keep going with the transcription rather than take a break. At the time of undergrad, I didn't realize I was doing this, so it's something just to be conscious of, trying to boundary yourself and still keep self-care activities going as well. Finally, I found, and I think this is wholly due to the imposter syndrome from working as a team, that actually I had a really inflated sense of pride and completion with the master's research. The overwhelming satisfaction at completing this alone potentially is due to the fact it was the methodology was statistics, and again, as I've mentioned, that's not my preference for analysis. So there was definitely pride in that, but also just in the fact that knowing I had completed a full piece of research, start to finish alone. So then on the flip side, in terms of disadvantages, I suppose there was a lot of responsibility and pressure on myself. Again, having come from working in joint data collection, I then felt quite a bit of pressure to, I suppose, uphold the standard of research I completed the year before when working as part of a team. Now, while the undergraduate dissertation, I hadn't had help obviously with the write-up, things like this, it was literally just that we collected interviews together. It still led to, I suppose, a piece of pressure internally and a bit of an inner critic to stand up to the same level I had the year before. Additionally, there was the aspect of second guessing myself, and this hindered my timeline, I suppose. I felt less secure when completing the master's dissertation, again, possibly because of the area, quantitative, and therefore I needed a lot of time to double check all the steps. As I didn't have accountability to anyone else other than myself, I found that I was not trusting my gut as much. Finally, the last disadvantage to the master's and working individually for research was that I felt less support. By that I mean peer support, not supervisor support. The silly questions that I had bounced off my peer the year before that I wouldn't have brought to my supervisor and didn't need to go to my supervisor, I wasn't able to say, so they often went unsaid, and then it would come up at a later point and I'd realize what I'd been missing or that I had skipped a simple step that I could have easily rectified had I had someone to talk out loud with. In terms of challenges met, as the disclaimer on this slide says, I honestly didn't meet any major obstacles in either form of dissertation. I initially found the idea of sharing data during the undergrad as daunting. Honestly, I was apprehensive about how we would work as a team, but this was simply a personal mental challenge. Once we started, I was pleasantly surprised at how well we worked together. The only time we came close to a challenge during undergraduate and shared data collection was with recruitment. However, we had a very difficult to access population we were looking at, so it was actually going to be a challenge whether it was done individually or part of a team. So honestly, having someone to rant about the stress with recruitment was very helpful. Also, when we sent a reminder email, we did get an onslaught of responses for recruitment, so this all worked out and wasn't a challenge really. So honestly, I didn't really find any major obstacles to working collaboratively. Similarly then for individual dissertation, I was under pressure, absolutely, but again, no great challenges. I had a clear vision of what I wanted to research, and even while I struggled with the statistics element, it was a huge learning point for me. And I knew prior to this that I had a preference for qualitative methods, so it was really just a great learning experience for me and showed me that my strengths lie elsewhere than I had previously thought. If I was to give any advice for those hoping to work collaboratively, there's 3 things I'd really say. Firstly, if I was to work as a team again for data collection, I would say to try and align your interests so that your idea and your passion are not put to the side. I strongly believe that if you're interested in your dissertation topic, it makes it easier to engage with, which makes the long slog of doing a dissertation much easier. I was lucky in that both myself and my peer wanted a specific cohort, and meshing both of our research questions into one interview schedule worked. However, I would say don't let your idea be minimized, but try and take advantage of the opportunity to work as part of a team if possible. Also, if the person is, I suppose, like-minded, you know the individual you're going to be working beside and you'll both work hard, that's great. If not, I would suggest trying to create a contract to keep each other accountable. So the likes of having the data collection for your 5 interviews done by 3 weeks' time, transcriptions done in another month, etc. Try and keep a schedule, reduce any possibility for stress if you're not sure about how you're going to work with the other individual involved. Have to say, I was honestly pleasantly surprised by my experience and made a really good friend out of the undergrad dissertation. Finally, I would have to say, if you don't have any idea or any set idea for your undergraduate thesis, I would definitely recommend asking your supervisor if there are any ongoing projects or other students who would like to work together, as not only did we create a great piece of work that we actually published, but I made, as I just said, a friend for life out of the process. And it was a huge stress reduction working with someone who shares your aim or goal to do well. So all in all, I'd like to say I really would recommend working as part of a team if possible. And I'd like to wish you all the best of luck as you go forward to complete your undergraduate dissertations. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. I can catch up on any chat and Q&A now. I just want to thank Andrea in her absence for sharing a really helpful insight into the feelings that come with working as part of a team. And also, can I just highlight that she was an absolute pleasure to supervise for her undergraduate, and I know for her postgraduate. And her undergraduate dissertation is published in a special issue of Journal of Health Psychology, a qualitative study of the experience of social support and disclosure for young adults in college with type 1 diabetes. And her postgraduate dissertation is currently almost at a publication stage as well in another journal. So I just want to thank her for her contribution. Now, our final speaker then will also provide some insights into working as part of a team for dissertations, and that's Adam O'Riordan. Adam is a PhD researcher at UL, and he has experience, I suppose, at the undergraduate level and of course as a postgraduate as well. So Adam, I'll hand over to you to share your experiences now.
So yeah, my name is Adam and I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Limerick, and I began working on group-based projects during the final year of my undergraduate degree. And I've continued on these types of similar group-based projects throughout my PhD. Can you see that there? Is everything okay?
Yeah, that's all fine, Adam.
That's perfect. Yeah, so today I'm just going to be sharing my experiences with working as part of a group-based project. So my research primarily focuses on the influence of stress on the cardiovascular system and how different psychological factors can influence how an individual psychologically and physiologically responds to stress in terms of their heart rate and blood pressure. So my experiences with group-based projects have been primarily centered around like experimental procedures in the lab. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of these types of experimental projects. So when a participant comes to the lab, typically they undergo an acclimatization period. So this is about 20 minutes in length. And here we're just getting participants to simply sit and relax. And this happens prior to the experimental phase. And here we're just getting participants to sit and relax and ensure that their heart rate and blood pressure isn't elevated because maybe they just come up the stairs or they're in a new environment. And then after this, we get participants to complete an experimental phase. And the experimental phase can be divided into 3 different periods. So first of all, we have the baseline period. This is about 10 minutes in length. So here we're just assessing resting cardiovascular function. So this is the participants' resting heart rate and blood pressure. Then we get participants to complete a stressor phase. So this is about 15 minutes in length. And here we just get participants to complete different types of stress tasks. And then finally, we get participants to complete a recovery phase. And here participants just simply sit and relaxing after the stress task. And we're just assessing how long it takes participants' cardiovascular parameters to return back to normal after the stress task. So this type of protocol actually allows for 3 different outcome measures. So first of all, we have baseline cardiovascular function, so resting heart rate and blood pressure. We have cardiovascular activity, which is during the stress task. So this is the person's cardiovascular reaction. So they're increasing heart rate and blood pressure in response to the stress task. And we have cardiovascular recovery. This is how long it takes the participants' cardiovascular parameters to return back to normal after the stress task. So during the acclimatization period, we actually get participants to complete a number of questionnaires to assess a range of different psychological constructs. So this allows us to examine how different psychological constructs influence different measures of cardiovascular health. So this allows for a number of unique projects from the one protocol. So for example, while one student might look at the influence of depression on resting cardiovascular function, so this might be like resting heart rate and resting blood pressure. Another student might look at the influence of anxiety and personality on how a person responds to stress in terms of the cardiovascular system or how they perceive the stressor. So typically on these projects, we have 1 PhD student working with approximately 5 final year project students. And normally all the students would either be supervised by 1 primary supervisor, or they would have supervisors with similar interests. So I found that there's a number of advantages to these group-based projects. So the first and most obvious advantage is time efficiency. So as we know, final year is a very busy time for undergraduate students. Between the dissertation itself and the coursework, students are very busy. And a data set for a cardiovascular activity data set typically requires about 100 participants. And data collection for each participant takes about an hour each. So that's 100 hours of work that needs to actually be done in the lab. So engaging in group-based project actually reduces the amount of hours a participant needs to be in the lab or a student needs to be in the lab from about 100 hours to approximately 20 hours. Secondly, I found it also made the most of our shared resources. So the lab space at the university is very busy. Some semesters we could even have up to 3 PhD students each working with 5 final year project students each on different projects. So normally what happens is each group will be allocated 1 or 2 days each in the lab. By engaging in a group-based project, you're ensuring that you're making the most of your allocated time in the lab and that there's always someone available to collect data during your allocated time. And the time spent in the lab is flexible to the student's personal and college timetable. So I found that myself, when I was doing my own final year project, and as a PhD student working with other final year students, students have different schedules, there are modules at different times. And because you're working with a large group of people, you can actually, in a way, have a choice in which hours you work in the lab. Secondly, some weeks students might be able to attend the lab during their allocated time slot, and they can actually swap the times with other students on the project. So a second advantage I found was sharing the workload. So apart from data collection, the actual procedure itself, there's a lot of work in terms of administrative work and that. So first of all is the ethics application. So I know that's been brought up a few times today. So an ethics application can be very time consuming for a final year student, particularly if they don't have experience with the research area already. So because you have several students working on the one project, they can actually do the one ethics application and draft a piece of the ethics application each. Secondly is the print and organization and stable the questionnaire packs. So I know this mightn't sound like it takes a long time, but it actually does. So as I said, we have 100 participants typically coming into the lab each semester. Each participant completes about 4 questionnaire booklets. Each booklet is about 20 pages in length. So what we do here is we actually get the group to meet once a week in the lab to do all the printing, all the organizing for the following week. That saves a lot of time. Organizing participant recruitment. So as we know, a lot of the samples for final year projects are actually made up of the participants, friends, classmates, and so on. It's up to the participant or the students to get their own sample. So by having more people on the project, you're actually ensuring that you actually have an adequate sample, that you have a greater network of participants to recruit. Data entry for thousands of variables. As I said, the participants complete an awful lot of questionnaire booklets. Data entry can take absolute hours. So what we done here was at the end of each week, we would actually take home booklets each, and we would each input data for a certain amount of participants. So I found with this project in particular, one of the major advantages was that it actually had all the benefits of an individual project. So sometimes there's this assumption that teaming up for mutual benefit actually results in like a shared project, shared hypothesis, shared ideas, and that the student actually loses the individuality of their project. But I found that this protocol actually allowed for students to design their own project around the protocol, form their own hypothesis and ideas. So I've listed a few independent variables here that students have looked at in the past, and myself, I've looked at some of them. So like some of the independent variables are personality, loneliness, addiction, gratitude, depression, eating disorders. And students can look at like how they directly influence cardiovascular health or how they interact or mediate with each other. And the students have a range of dependent variables to choose from. They can look at like resting, blood pressure and heart rate, how these factors influence perceptions of stress, how they influence how an individual responds to the stressor itself in terms of the cardiovascular response, and how it influences cardiovascular recovery from stress. So although the students are all working on a similar protocol, there's a range of actual projects, unique projects that can be taken from this protocol. So the fourth advantage, and I really felt this myself when I was doing my own FYP, was helping and support from the other students on the project. So first of all, practicing the experimental protocol with the cardiovascular equipment. So before students actually start collecting data with participants, they require an awful lot of training, particularly with the cardiovascular equipment and the experimental protocol. And the participants also require an awful lot of practice themselves with maybe like pilot studies or people who won't be actually included in the sample because things might go wrong and stuff like that. But I found it was really good to be able to practice with other students who were also on the project, because you could get things wrong here with the other students and so on. And by the time students actually go to collect data with participants, they're very confident. Sharing knowledge, articles found, and feedback with other students. So I also found that because all of us were working on a similar paradigm, it has a similar theoretical underpinning. It was nice to be able to bounce ideas off each other, chat about different theories, and we're able to share papers with each other and so on. And this is actually very beneficial than working on your own, because when you're a final year project student, you're new to a research area, you're not familiar with the literature, and it can be very daunting trying to go and understand all these theories and literature on your own. I also found when I was doing my own PhD, my own FYP, I was working with a PhD student on the project, which was very beneficial because a final year project student might only meet their supervisor once every week or two, but you actually get to work with a PhD student who's quite familiar with the field a few times a week. And it's really good being able to chat to them about your own project, the theories, and they can provide you with really good guidance. So you have this ongoing interaction with someone who actually has quite a lot of knowledge about the research area. And working as part of a group during the final year provides a sense of security the students are on track. So during my own final year project, I found that some of my classmates became quite anxious throughout the year several times, because they would be looking at other people on different projects and be benchmarking their own performance against other people's performance on their projects. And these could be two people on quite different projects. So one person might be in the lab doing an experimental project, another person might be doing like a cross-sectional project using questionnaire data, and they're quite different. And what happens is students actually look at someone else and they start to get anxious at the fact that someone else is far ahead regards data collection and so on. But working as part of the group, I felt you kind of benchmarked your performance and where you are against other people in the group, and it kind of eliminated that sense of anxiety around that. So there wasn't many disadvantages, but there definitely is some challenges to note, I think. The first one is that students don't often want to engage in group projects. And I actually had this fear myself when I was doing my final year project. So there's this fear of like that grades are going to be dragged down to others who are less invested, that others are going to benefit from your hard work, and that there's a lack of control over your work, that you won't be able to form your own ideas, your own hypothesis, and that there's going to be an unequal distribution of the workload, so that you're going to be carrying other people on the project. I've also heard other final year project students kind of have these fears when they begin collecting data, but this was eliminated for me when my supervisor told me like that we're going to ensure that everyone's going to contribute equally to the project, and that there is going to be an individuality aspect to the project whereby you form your own hypothesis and you're conducting your own study. So a second challenge would be the equal distribution of the workload, and I think we've managed this quite well. So firstly, a timetable for data collection I think is very important. So before we start data collection, we actually allocate time slots to each student equally. So each student might be in the lab 5 hours each per week. And this ensures that each student is actually collecting data equally. Equal amounts of questionnaires given to students for data input. So at the end of each week, we actually equally distributed the questionnaire booklets, so everyone is equally contributing to data input. And students joining the project at a later stage must either only use the data they collected or make up lost time. So often students might join the project late, and sometimes this would happen, like let's say if a master's research project student was also collecting data. And what we do here is we would ensure that either the student who was joining late would only use the data that they collected from the period when they started, or if they wanted to have access to the entire data set, that they would actually make up the hours they lost. So the final challenge is ensuring that all students are invested in the project. So while some students are very invested in the project and they do adhere to the experimental protocol, and they ask questions and they really try their best, other students are less invested. And this can result in incorrect procedures in the lab, can result in lost data. You can have students not turning up for time slots that they're scheduled to collect data for. So I found that the best way to eliminate this is to maybe keep a record and be transparent about data collection. Everyone keeps a record of what work they're doing and so on. So overall, my experience was very positive. I definitely recommend a group-based project. It's definitely very time efficient. The workload is equally distributed between students, and you benefit a lot from other students in the group in terms of knowledge, sharing articles, and just generally supporting each other overall. The overall thing that I think is very important when engaging in these group-based projects is to ensure the students do have freedom over their project in terms of forming their own ideas, and having their own hypothesis and so on. So that is my experience of the group-based project.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's really interesting to hear very different student experiences because, of course, you were working on a quant lab-based project, and Andrea would have been paired for a qualitative project, which is a little bit different. And she spoke about having to make sure that they had clear understandings of each other's projects and not to, I suppose, borrow ideas without meaning to, given they were working on related questions, I suppose. So thank you so much. So we're going to go to a bit of a panel discussion and a Q&A session now. So if I can have everybody on unmuted. Now, if anyone has any questions, please post in the chat, please raise your hand, or please use the Q&A. I am just going to share one slide just as a reminder of the preprint and so on. And I don't see any questions that we haven't answered so far, but I want to go to some that were asked earlier for a little bit more detail. So I know, Marek, you asked if consortium projects like this, have there been any misalignments between academic terms between institutions, and has this caused difficulties? So Kate mentioned that there can be quite a bit of variability, which is difficult to manage at times. We also have some comments, and this is one I think will be very interesting. Are there opportunities for a mix of qualitative and quantitative studies in a consortium approach? So this question, I suppose I'll field it because Andrea is not here, if that's okay. Kate mentioned, of course, there are opportunities to do that. One issue that wasn't covered in Andrea's talk is when you think about the reflexivity of somebody in relation to the data, in terms of the establishing rapport for interviews, in terms of analyzing the data, this is something that becomes more complex the more you share data collection across a number of people. So I found a paired situation worked very well. Myself and a colleague both had a student who wanted to explore topics in people with type 1 diabetes. So we said, look, we need to share data collection here. But more than two, I think things could get messy at a student level. And it just worked so well with two. But I think it would have been that bit more difficult with three. So for me, I won't be embarking on any consortium for qualitative for that reason, but a mini consortium or a pair was certainly effective. And I'm about to embark on a study for which I have the pre-registration, a qualitative study where the analysis will be shared across a number of people. There will be more than two interviewers because we're hoping to match interviewers to the people they'll be interviewing on some characteristics. So I'll let you know how that goes. But my sense is that a full consortium might be more difficult, but I'd be interested to hear anyone else's thoughts.
Yeah, so I think my understanding of that question was that the mixed methods approach, so the qualitative and the quantitative. So I think you're exactly right. You probably wouldn't have, because of the slightly different nature, I don't think you'd need a large consortia for qualitative on its own. I think two students working together is a really good model because you get the data checking and the duplicate transcribing and so on, which are all very good things, but then you also keep that reflexivity that Anne-Marie was talking about. But my reading of that question was that actually it was more of a mixed methods approach. So, quite often, especially in the primary care research and things like that, you would have mixed method approaches where you might have a qualitative component and then a quantitative evaluation of, say, an intervention, and a qualitative study of the patient's experiences and kind of acceptability, feasibility, that kind of thing perhaps as well. And so I could see that working really quite well, because you would then have perhaps different supervisors, a qualitative supervisor who looks at the work, who oversees the work package, the complementary work package that is the kind of qualitative study with perhaps two students working on it. And then you could have a much bigger bigger team of undergraduate students working on perhaps a quantitative component if they were complementary. So I think there's, I think there's kind of nice ideas around this complementarity of supervisors' expertise. So another thing that I think could work quite well would be, say, for example, if you wanted to do an EEG study where you also had a behavioural component. So you might see in a department you have an EEG supervisor who oversees that kind of element of the project, and then somebody who focuses more on, say, the behavioural task and analysis. So you've got two sets of students perhaps working on an overall related project, but within two different particular methodologies that are complement each other. And I can see a whole host of different exciting opportunities for collaboration in that sort of way, where you've got the kind of bringing together of different types of expertise. And I'm involved in a couple of those sorts of sets up in my own department. Actually, they're not across institutions, but they are. I'm collaborating with colleagues in my department. It's quite a fun way to get to know colleagues that are slightly outside of your discipline in your own department.
And Great, thank you, Kate. Just on the complementarity, I found that as well as a supervisor of a team approach. It was really nice to be able to rely on someone else who had expertise I didn't have. So I would lead on bits where I had expertise and he would do other elements. And that was really nice as a supervisor, especially if you're starting out. Emily, you spoke to the mixed methods element. Do you have anything to add to what Kate had said?
Yeah, I mean, so I've done the mixed methods with just my own students this year rather than working with another supervisor. The approach I've taken, so I am very quant training, but kind of slowly trying to train myself, you know, like I'm trying to kind of expand it to mixed methods. So that's been something I've been kind of working towards over the last few years. So my students are all, for the ones on the qualitative side, we have an advanced qualitative level 4 option that they can take. So they all have to take that as well to help support the project. But then I have an external collaborator as well who isn't involved at a kind of supervisory level, but is there in the background for me as well, for the qualitative side. So it's the mixed method stuff has been really useful to help me as in my own training to make this shift towards more mixed methods while still having the expertise there. So yeah, I think there's actually been both kind of student and staff benefits to doing that. But the having one of each avoids any issues with the reflexivity and stuff. So that's been quite helpful, particularly, you know, as someone who is just starting to make that shift, then kind of dealing with a more complex reflexivity is not really on my priority list of things to be dealing with. So yeah, but it's worked really well. And there is the issue whereby, if you're only doing one quant project, it has all the same issues as it would normally, but certainly the depth and the breadth of data that we now have, I think I'm much happier, particularly with exploratory projects. I think I haven't really done anything confirmatory this year, but the exploratory ones have worked really well.
Excellent. And can I ask, it's not a question in the chat, Adam, but I was listening to you and I was listening to Andrea, and I noticed that there was a lot of talk about feelings. So feeling anxious about maybe sharing data collection, feeling pride when one did it by themselves. Have you any advice for supervisors then on managing that emotional element of placing your trust in other people?
I think for me, it was mainly about highlighting the fact that it is an individual project, that you shouldn't feel like you're actually relying on someone else, regards your grades and regards your ideas and your hypothesis and so on. And that when you are relying on other people, it's for data collection and so on and so forth, and that it's going to be very well managed. And that kind of relieves the fear around working in a group. Because I think a big fear is when you're going into a group, especially a large group, you're afraid that there is going to be certain people in the group who won't work, who won't carry the weight, or that you're going to end up doing more work, or that your work is going to be dependent on them. So I think just reassuring students at the very start, because that was eliminated for me at the very start when I was talking to my supervisor. I was told, like, the work that you do will be acknowledged, that we can see that the project is individual, and that the work that people actually do in the lab will be monitored.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm getting some key themes here that actually I hadn't thought that much about feelings, but actually the emotional element is important for the undergraduate dissertation, and that planning initially is quite important. So we have a question in the chat from Catherine. For their larger scale consortium projects, Kate, this one is for you. Could you comment on funding? Is that part of PhD or postdoc led project, or is purely pooling funding associated with undergraduate projects?
Yeah, so it's depended on, so we decide who takes the lead on the project that year, depending on who's got some who wants to take a lead on it, who's in a position, who has a student that's in a position in their PhD that it kind of would work well. So or in a postdoc position where it would work well. So those kind of things come in. We don't have direct funding for the consortium approach, but what we do is we try to borrow from studies that may be funded in already going on in the groups. So for example, I think in the second year, the project was run by Lucia, who is Chris Chambers' PhD, was Chris Chambers' PhD student at the time, and she did a chapter in her PhD that was also related to the consortium project. So she was able to use the work that was going on for a publication, but also for a chapter in her PhD, and that worked really well. Then the following year, I had Katie Hobbs has been working with me on a MRC funded PhD, and she was in her second year, which I think is a good time to do these sorts of things, because you're not at the critical end of your PhD where you need all the time for writing up, but you're not right at the beginning when you're designing. So I think second year PhD students, it seems to fit quite well in there, because that seems to be where they'll have the space, for it to work. And so she led on something that wasn't actually part of her PhD, but was an interesting project that we kind of wanted to do. And I think the experience she got from that was actually really helpful in CV writing and things like that, because there's such an experience of leading a research project that you can then wax lyrical about when you're writing references to your PhD students. So I think the skills they gain aren't just not always about having an actual chapter in your PhD. It's also about being able to kind of show leadership, and this is a kind of tangible leadership skill that they've developed, and we can document afterwards. And then this year's consortium has been run by Lucia again, who is now a postdoc. She's got some ESRC funding. We're still working with Chris Chambers in Cardiff, and so she's used some of her PhD some of her postdoctoral funding has funded the prolific study that we've run this year with the students, and she's really loved it. I think she's taken on a really active role in kind of leading the consortium, and then we have weekly Zoom meetings, and it's the students have had I think this year have had a particularly wonderful experience, because they've been able to see exactly what goes on behind in all the detailed kind of coding decisions for task development and things like that, because with screen share, it's another opportunity. So I hope that answers your question. We haven't got direct funding, but we sort of work it so that who's got the sort of the time window. There's a project that fits this kind of thing, and it seems to work with what everyone's doing at the moment. We're just very flexible about who leads the consortium based on those considerations.
Excellent. So if I'm to summarize, Kate, if there's a funded project, you'll probably try and use that to link students in, because you won't have to worry about funding separately. And then, of course, you're linking students to your own interests as well. But sometimes there might be that bit of space for somebody who wants to lead on a particular piece of work that may or may not be important in the thesis, but will demonstrate leadership skills. There's a couple of ways of doing that. Okay, we have a question from Samantha Dockeray. Can anyone describe what processes they've found useful to support academic integrity and student confidence in same? For example, the amount of similarity on methods, descriptions, etc. In my experience, students get very worried about this in group projects, as do examiners. Excellent question, Samantha. Adam, would you have thoughts on that before I answer it? How did you feel, for example, about writing up things like the methods section separately?
So you're saying
would you be worried, for example, that these are supposed to be individual pieces of work, and you're sharing a protocol at minimum with people? How did you manage that?
Well, I think the thing is like that theoretically the projects are different at their core. Like a lot of the projects would have different theoretical underpinnings, and my approach on that would be that if two people have two different hypotheses that can be addressed using the one protocol, that'd be more beneficial than doing two different projects.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It is a tricky one for write-up.
Yeah.
I have found that having students write individually, first of all, they can write these pieces of work individually. They don't sit down together and write their protocol unless they're doing their pre-registration. So they're writing up individually. For the qualitative example, I suppose we made sure to bring the students together for certain elements and then send them on their separate ways to individual meetings. So I and my colleague would have met them as a pair at times, but when it came to things like analysis, we went our separate ways, so that there was a very clear individual projects arising from a shared data set. So it is something you have to watch. Something else that came to my mind as being helpful. I also think just being very upfront and clear about why you're sharing data collection. That's a form of research integrity in itself, making the most of your resources by sharing data collection. You're not wasting participants' time, you're getting a better sample size. So illustrating all these qualities can also help, but certainly I would encourage people to do their writing separately, to do their analysis separately. And whenever I've used a group, it's always been a mix of group meetings and then individual intellectual development meetings. Would anyone have anything to add to that? Emily, would that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think just I give them very, very clear boundaries about what is acceptable and what isn't. So at the beginning of the year, I said to them, you should share papers, you should share ideas, you should share discussion. Do not under any circumstances share your writing with each other, because even if you're not doing it intentionally, it's so easy to regurgitate someone else's wording. So I was very clear that they should never share writing, and that seems to have worked quite. They proofread each other's, but at the end, and that's like in the last week. So it's kind of that's I think less of an issue. But also by that point, the way that we do it is they can hand in an intro, method, and results that we can comment on. We can comment on a first draft of it, and then the discussion's their own. So I've already seen all of theirs by that point, so I would kind of know if there was perhaps any issue there, but I haven't really had their. I think having that very clear boundary, like you can do this, but don't do that, I think they found useful. It was just a nice, clear set of rules for them to follow.
Yeah. It's also interesting how different method sections from the same study can be.
Yeah, that's right. I would just add one thing there, which is in the first years when we did the consortium, I had the students, we kind of wrote these, I used to write my study protocols with quite a long background and introduction. And so we'd write that as a team, and then we'd have this really well-written, well, not always so well-written, but fairly well-written introduction with lots of references and things. And we developed a similar thing for our MSc program, where we had a research proposal unit where the students would do a research proposal, and then that would be like the precursor to their dissertation. And what we were finding was problems with self-plagiarism, because obviously they've done all this beautiful work writing their introduction, which is then going on the Open Science Framework or whatever. And then of course it's a published piece of work. So then when they want to use their own work that they've already done in their dissertation, it can lead to problems of self-plagiarism. So now what I do actually is, well, usually it's the kind of early career researcher PI that would draft the study protocol that goes on to the Open Science Framework, and the students just put their own little moderator hypotheses in or secondary hypotheses in. But also I'm starting to encourage my students to write very short rationale. So it's not a long introduction, it's not a background literature search. It is simply a paragraph of a very brief rationale, a little bit of research in context, and straight into the hypotheses. So they're not wasting time doing really beautiful, lovely introductions that they then can't use for their dissertation later on. So that's just one thing to bear in mind, is self-plagiarism can also be a bit of an issue with pre-registration.
So to summarize the techniques there, what Kate said, have a short rationale and don't publish your introductions. Try not to have people read each other's writing, because it can be hard not to draw on that overly heavily. Maybe consider bringing people together for elements of the project, but maintaining some individual meetings where you can see that intellectual development, you can see the separate thought, and bring that in. And also be upfront in the write-up about this is collected as part of a larger project. So, and maybe discuss those aspects of research integrity too. So they are some good strategies overall. Now I'm going to take one more question before we wrap up. Oh, wait, I've answered this. Great. Thanks, Samantha, for your comments. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to a close. I would just want to thank all of our speakers and also the National Forum for hosting the seminar, but also for suggesting that the role of students with recent experience would be really important to make more of in the seminar. So hopefully we did that today. Just to summarize, there are a lot of key ideas here that we have posted in the preprint Emily has shared, and we really, really welcome feedback on those. Part of the rationale here was to document what's already been done and make that explicit, because it hasn't been to the degree that it could be, and also to make recommendations about how we can bring research and teaching closer in alignment, particularly as research moves forward in certain ways. I'd also really value some feedback and more consideration of qualitative methods, which we did talk about, but there's always room for more consideration there. And I also really value the student perspective that probably we don't have to the same degree in our preprint, understanding feelings about working together, feelings of pride as well in working on an individual piece of work, and how to manage those group elements. A key takeaway from these discussions for me is you need to invest in those group elements at the start. It's not an easier way of doing things, it's just a different way. So that is all from me. There'll be a recording available at some point soon. And I just want to thank again our speakers. So Kate Button from Bath, Emily Nordman from University of Glasgow, Andrea Habenicht and Adam O'Riordan from University of Limerick. Thank you very much, everybody.